Hello and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Child 44 by Tom Rob Smith. 800 kilometers east of Moscow. 16 March. Asked whether or not she loved him, Raisa had refused to answer. She just admitted to lying about being pregnant. So even if she'd said, "Yes, I love you. I've always loved you," Leo wouldn't have believed her. She certainly wasn't about to stare into his eyes and spell out some fanciful description. What was the point of the question anyway? It was as though he had some kind of epiphany. A revelation that their marriage wasn't built on love and affection. If she'd answered truthfully, "No, I've never loved you," all of a sudden he would have been the victim. The implication being that their marriage had been a trick played on him by her. She was the con artist who toyed with his gullible heart. Out of nowhere, he was a romantic. Perhaps it was the shock of losing his job. But since when had love been part of the arrangement? He'd never asked her about it before. He'd never said, "I love you." She hadn't expected him to. He'd asked her to marry him, true. She'd said yes. He'd wanted a marriage. He'd wanted a wife. He'd wanted her, and he'd got what he wanted. Now, that wasn't enough. Having lost his authority, having lost the power to arrest whoever he wanted, he was choked with sentimentalism. And why was it her pragmatic deceit, rather than his profound mistrust, that had brought this illusion of marital contentment crashing down around them? Why couldn't she demand that he had to convince her of his love? After all, he'd presumed incorrectly that she'd been unfaithful. He'd set up an entire surveillance team, a process which could easily have resulted in her arrest. He'd broken trust between them long before she'd been forced to. Her motivation for doing so had been survival. His had been a pathetic male anxiety. Ever since they'd entered their names as man and wife into the ledger, even before that, ever since they started seeing each other, she'd been conscious that if she displeased him, he could have her killed. It had become a blunt of reality. It had become a blunt reality of her life. She had to keep him happy. When Zoya had been arrested, the very sight of him, his uniform, his talk about the state made her so angry she found it impossible to utter more than a couple of words to him. In the end, the question was very simple. Did she want to live? She was a survivor, and the fact of her survival, the fact that she was the only remaining member of her family, defined her. Indignation at Zoya's arrest was a luxury. It achieved nothing, and so she'd got into his bed and slept beside him, slept with him. She'd cooked him dinner, hating the sound of him eating. She'd washed his clothes, hating his smell. For the past few weeks, she'd sat idle in their apartment, knowing full well he'd been weighing up whether he'd made the right decision. Should he have spared her life? Was she worth the risk? Was she pretty enough? Nice enough? good enough. Unless every gesture and glance pleased him, she'd be in mortal danger. Well, that time was over. She was sick of the powerlessness, the dependency upon his goodwill. Yet now he seemed to be under the impression that she was in his debt. She'd stated the obvious. She wasn't an international spy. She was a secondary school teacher. In repayment, he wanted a declaration of her love. It was insulting. He was no longer in a position to demand anything. He had no leverage over her, just as she had none over him. They were both in the same dire straits. Their lives' possessions reduced to one suitcase each, exiled to some far-flung town. They were equals as they had never been equal before. If he wanted to hear about love, the first verse was his to sing. Leo brooded over Raiza's remarks. It seemed that she'd granted herself the right to judge him, to hold him in contempt, while pretending that her hands were clean. But she'd married him knowing what he did for a living. She'd enjoyed the perks of his position. She'd eaten the rare foods he'd been able to bring home. She'd bought clothes from the well-stocked Spetstorgi, stores restricted to state officials. If she was so appalled by his work, why hadn't she rejected his advances? Everyone understood that it was necessary in order to survive, to compromise. He'd done things that were distasteful, morally objectionable. A clear conscience was, for most people, an impossible luxury and one Raiza could hardly lay claim to. Had she taught her classes according to her genuine beliefs? Evidently not, considering her indignation at the state security apparatus. But at school she must have expressed her support for it, explained to her students how their state operated, applauded it, indoctrinated them to agree with it, and even encouraged them to denounce one another. If she hadn't, she would have almost certainly been denounced by one of her own students. Her job was not only to toe the line, but to shut down her pupils' questioning facilities. And it would be her job to do it again in their new town. As far Leo was concerned, he and his wife were spokes in the same wheel. As far as Leo was concerned, he and his wife were spokes in the same wheel. The train stopped at Mutava for an hour. Raiza broke the day-long silence between them. "We should eat something." By which she meant that they should stick to practical arrangements. It had been the foundation for their relationship. It had been the foundation for their relationship this far. Surviving whatever challenges they had coming. That was the glue between them, not love. They got out of the carriage. A woman was pacing the platform with a wicker basket. They bought hard-boiled eggs, a paper pouch of salt, chunks of tough rye bread. Sitting side by side on a bench, they peeled their eggs, collecting the shells in their laps, sharing the salt, and saying nothing at all to each other. The train's speed dropped as it climbed towards the mountains, passing through black pine forests. In the distance, over the treetops, the mountains could be seen jutting upwards like the uneven teeth in a bottom jaw. The tracks opened out into a clearing. Sprawled before them was a vast assembly plant, tall chimneys, interconnected warehouse-like buildings suddenly appearing in the middle of a wilderness. It was as though God had sat on the Ural mountains, smashed his fist down on the landscape before him, sending trees flying, and demanded that this newly created space be filled with chimneys and steel presses. This was the first glimpse of their new home. Leo's knowledge of this town came from propaganda and paperwork. Previously, little more than timber mills and the collection of timber huts for the people who worked in them. The once modest settlement of 20,000 inhabitants had caught Stalin's eye. Upon closer examination of its natural and man-made resources, he'd declared it insufficiently productive. The river Ufa ran nearby. There were the steel and iron processing plants in Sverdlovsk, only 160 kilometers east, and ore mines in the mountains, and it had the benefit of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Vast locomotives passed through this town each day, and nothing more was added to them than planks of wood. He decided that this would be the ideal location to assemble an automobile. The GAZ-20, a car intended to rival the vehicles produced in the West, built according to the highest specifications. Its successor, currently under design, the Volga GAZ-21, was being upheld as the pinnacle of Soviet engineering, designed to survive the harsh climate with high ground clearance, enviable suspension, a bulletproof engine, and rust proofing on a scale unheard of in the United States of America. Whether that was true or not, Leo had no way of knowing. He knew it was a car only a tiny percent of Soviet citizens could afford, far beyond the financial reach of the men and women employed in its assembly. Construction on the factory began some time after the war, and 18 months later the Volga assembly plant stood in the middle of the pine forests. He couldn't remember the number of prisoners reported to have died in its construction. Not that the numbers were reliable anyway. Leo had only become actively involved after the factory had been completed. Thousands of free workers had been vetted and transferred by compulsory writ from cities across the country to fill the newly created labor gap. The population rising fivefold over the space of 5 years. Leo had done background checks on some of the Moscow workers transferred here. If they passed the checks, they were packed up and moved out within the week. If they failed, they were arrested. He'd been one of the gatekeepers to this town. He was sure that this was one of the reasons that Vasily had picked this place. The irony must have amused him. Raisa missed this first glimpse of their new home. She was asleep, wrapped up in her coat, her head resting against the window, rocking silently with the motion of the train. Moving to the seat beside his wife and facing in the direction they were traveling, he could see how the main town was latched onto the side of the vast assembly plant, as though it was a tick sucking on the neck of a dog. First and foremost, this was a place of industrial production. A distant second, a place to live. The lights of apartment blocks glowed dim orange against the grey sky. Leo nudged Raisa. She woke, looking at Leo, then out of the window. "We're here." The train pulled into the station. They collected their cases, stepping down onto the platform. It was colder than Moscow. The temperature had dropped by at least a couple of degrees. They stood like two evacuee children arriving in the country for the first time, staring at their unfamiliar surroundings. They'd been given no instructions. They knew no one. They didn't even have a number to call. No one was waiting for them. The station building was empty except for a man seated at the ticket booth. He was young, not much more than 20. He watched them intently as they entered the building. Raiza approached him. "Good evening. We need to get to the headquarters of the militia." "You're from Moscow?" "That's right." The man opened the door of his ticket booth. Stepping out onto the concourse, he pointed out of the glass doors towards the street outside. "They're waiting for you." 100 paces from the station entrance was a militia car. Passing a snow-capped stone carving of Stalin's profile, chiseled into a slab of rock like a fossilized impression, Raiza and Leo moved towards the car. A GAZ-20, no doubt one of the cars produced by this town. As they got closer, they could see two men sitting in the front. The door opened. One of the men stepped out, a middle-aged man with broad shoulders. "Leo Demidov?" "Yes. I'm General Nesterov, head of Voualsk's militia." Leo wondered why he'd bothered to meet them. Surely Vasily had given instructions to make the experience as unpleasant as possible. But it didn't matter what Vasily had said. The arrival of a former MGB agent from Moscow was going to put the militia on their guard. They wouldn't believe that he was merely here to join their ranks. They almost certainly suspected an ulterior agenda and presumed that, for whatever reason, he'd be reporting back to Moscow. The more Vasily had tried to convince them otherwise, the more suspicious they would have become. Why would an agent travel hundreds of kilometers to join a small-scale militia operation? It didn't make sense. In a classless society, the militia were near the bottom of the heap. Every school child was taught that murder, theft, and rape were symptoms of a capitalist society, and the role of the militia had been ranked accordingly. There was no need to steal and no violence between citizens because there was equality. There was no need for a police force in a communist state. It was for this reason that the militia were nothing more than a lowly subsection of the Ministry of the Interior. Poorly paid, poorly respected, a force comprised of secondary school dropouts, farm workers kicked off the kolkhoz, discharged army personnel, and men whose judgment could be bought with a half bottle of vodka. Officially, the USSR's crime rates were close to zero. The newspapers frequently pointed out the vast sums of money the United States of America was forced to waste on crime prevention, with its needs for gleaming police cars and police officers in crisp, clean uniforms visible on every street corner, without which its society would crumble. The West employed many of their bravest men and women fighting crime, citizens who could have better spent their time building something. None of that manpower was squandered here. All that was needed was a ragtag group of strong but otherwise useless men who were good for nothing more than breaking up drunken brawls. That was the theory. Leo had no idea what the real crime statistics were. He had no desire to find out, since those who knew were probably liquidated on a regular basis. Factory production figures filled Pravda's front page, the middle pages and the back pages too. Good news was the only news worth printing. High birth rates, mountaintop train lines, and new canals. Taking this into account, Leo's arrival was a striking anomaly. A post in the MGB held more blood, respect, more influence, more material benefit than almost any other job. An officer wouldn't voluntarily step down, and if he was disgraced, why hadn't he simply been arrested? Even disavowed from the MGB, he still carried its shadow, potentially a valuable asset. Nesterov carried their cases to the car as effortlessly as if they'd been empty. He loaded them into the boot before opening the back door for them. Inside, Leo watched his new superior officer as he climbed into the front passenger seat. He was too large, even for this impressive vehicle. His knees came up near his chin. There was a young officer, seated behind the wheel. Nesterov didn't bother to introduce him. In similar fashion to the MGB, there were drivers responsible for each vehicle. Officers weren't given their own car and didn't drive themselves. The driver put the car into gear, pulling out into an empty road. There wasn't another car in sight. Nesterov waited a while, no doubt not wanting to seem like he was interrogating his new recruit, before glancing at Leo in the rear-view mirror and asking, "We were told 3 days ago that you were coming here. It's an unusual transfer. We must go where we're needed. No one has been transferred here for some time. I certainly made no request for any additional men. The output of the factory is considered a high priority. You can never have too many men working to ensure the security of this town." Riza turned towards her husband, guessing that his enigmatic answers were deliberate. Even demoted, even tossed out of the MGB, he was still making use of the fear it instilled. In their precarious circumstances, it seemed a sensible thing to do. Nesterov asked, "Tell me, are you to be a Sishchik? Sishchik? A detective?" We were confused about the orders. They said no. They said you were to be an Uchatskovi, which is a significant demotion in responsibility for a man of your status. My orders are to report to you. I leave my rank in your hands." There was silence. Raiza supposed the general didn't like having the question pushed back at him. Uncomfortable with the situation, he gruffly added, "For the moment, you'll stay in guest accommodation. Once an apartment has been found, it will be assigned to you. I should warn you that there is a very long waiting list, and there's nothing I can do about that. There are no advantages to being a militianer." The car stopped outside what appeared to be a restaurant. Nesterov opened the boot, picking up the cases and depositing them on the pavement. Leo and Raiza stood, awaiting instructions. Addressing Leo, Nesterov said, "Once you've taken your cases to your room, please come back to the car. Your wife doesn't need to come." Raiza suppressed her irritation at being spoken about as if she wasn't present. She watched as Leo, mimicking Nesterov, picked up both their cases. She marveled at this bravado but decided against embarrassing him. He could struggle with her case if he wanted to. Walking just in front, he pushed open the door, entering the restaurant. Inside it was dark, the shutters were closed, and the air stank of stale smoke. Last night's dirty glasses cluttered the table. Leo put the cases down and knocked on one of the greasy tabletops. The silhouette of a man appeared at the door. "We're not open!" "My name is Leo Demidov. This is my wife, Raiza. We've just arrived from Moscow." "Daniel Basarov." "I've been told by General Nesterov you have accommodation for us." You mean the room upstairs? I don't know. Yes, I suppose. Basarov scratched the rolls of his stomach. Let me show you to your room. The room was small. 2 single beds had been pushed together. There was a gap down the middle, both mattresses dipped. The wallpaper was bubbled like adolescent skin, lined with some kind of grease, sticky to touch. Leo figured it must be cooking oil, since the bedroom was directly over the kitchen, which could be seen through cracks in the floorboards. Cracks which ventilated the room with the smell of whatever had been or was cooking below, boiled offal, gristle, and animal fat. Basarov was put out by Nestorov's request. These beds and this room had been used by his staff, which is to say the women who worked his customers. However, he'd been unable to decline the request. He didn't own the building, and he required the goodwill of the militia in order to function as a business. They knew he was making a profit, and they were fine with it as long as they got a share. It was undeclared, unofficial, a closed system. If the truth was told, he was a little nervous of his guests. Having heard they were MGP, it stopped him being as rude as he would naturally have been. He pointed down the hall towards a door, which was partly ajar. There's the bathroom. We've got one indoors. Raisa tried to open the window. It had been nailed shut. She stared at the view. Ramshackle housing, dirty snow. This was home. Leo felt tired. He'd been able to handle his humiliation while it had remained a concept, but now that it had a physical form, this room, he just wanted to sleep, to close his eyes and shut out the world. Obliged to go back outside, he put his case on the bed, unable to look at Raisa, not out of anger, but out of shame. He walked out without saying a word. Driven to the town's telephone exchange, Leo was led inside. There was a queue of several hundred people waiting for their allotted time, a couple of minutes. Since most of them had been forced to leave behind their families in order to work here, Leo could appreciate that these minutes were extremely precious. Nestorov had no need to queue, heading into a cubicle. Once he'd set up the call, which involved a conversation Leo couldn't hear, he handed the receiver to him. Leo put the receiver to his ear. He waited. How's the accommodation? It was Vasily. He continued. You want to hang up, don't you? But you can't. You can't even do that. What is it you want? To stay in touch, so you can tell me about life over there, and I can tell you about life here. Before I forget, the pleasant apartment you'd arranged for your parents, it's been taken back. We found them somewhere more suitable to their status. It's a little cold and crowded, perhaps. Dirty, certainly. They're sharing with a family of 7, I think, including 5 young children. By the way, I didn't know your father suffered from terrible back pain. Shame that he has to return to the assembly line floor only a year from retirement. 1 year can be made to feel like 10 when you're not enjoying your job. But you'll soon know all about that. My parents are good people. They've worked hard. They've done you no harm. But I'm going to hurt them all the same. What do you want from me? An apology. Vasily, I'm sorry. You don't even know what you're sorry for. I treated you badly, and I'm sorry. What are you sorry for? Be specific. Your parents are depending on you. I shouldn't have hit you. You're not trying hard enough. Convince me. Desperate, Leo's voice was trembling. I don't understand what you want. You have everything. I have nothing. It's simple. I want to hear you beg. I'm begging you, Vasily. Listen to my voice. I am begging you. Leave my parents alone. Please. Vasily had hung up. Voualsk, 17 March. Having walked all night, his feet blistered, his socks sodden with blood, Leo sat down on a park bench, put his head in his hands, and wept. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. Last night, when Raisa had tried to talk to him, he'd ignored her. When she'd brought him food from the restaurant, he ignored that too. Unable to stay in their tiny, stinking room any longer, he'd gone downstairs, elbowed his way through the crowd, making his way outside. He'd walked without any sense of direction, too frustrated, too angry to sit still and do nothing, although he realized that was exactly the nature of his predicament. He could do nothing. Once again, he was faced with an injustice, but this time he was no longer able to intervene. His parents wouldn't be shot in the back in the head. That would be too swift, too much an approximation of mercy. Instead, they'd be persecuted drip by drip. He could imagine the variety of options open to a methodical, sadistic, and petty mind. In their respective factories, they'd been demoted, given the hardest, dirtiest jobs, jobs a young man or woman would struggle with. They'd be goaded with stories of Leo's pitiful exile, his disgrace and humiliation. Perhaps they'd even be told that he was in a gulag, sentenced to 20 years of katorga, hard labor. As for the family that his parents were forced to share an apartment with, there was no doubt that they'd be as disruptive and as pleasant as possible. The children would be promised chocolate if they made a lot of noise. The adults promised their own apartment if they stole food, argued, and through whatever means available made home life intolerable. He didn't need to guess the details. Vasily would enjoy reporting them, knowing that Leo wouldn't dare hang up the phone since he was afraid that whatever hardships his parents were experiencing would double as a result. Vasily would break him from afar, systematically applying pressure where he was vulnerable. His family. There was no defense. With a little work, Leo discovered his parents' address, but all he could do, if his letters weren't intercepted and burnt, would be to reassure them he was safe. He'd built them a comfortable life only to have it ripped from under their feet at a time when they could least handle the change. He stood up, shivering with cold, with some difficulty, and no idea what he was going to do next. He began to retrace his steps back to his new home. Raisa was downstairs sitting at the table. She'd been waiting for him all night. She knew, just as Vasily had predicted, that Leo now regretted his decision not to denounce her. The price was too high. But what was she supposed to do? Pretend that he'd risk everything for a perfect love. It wasn't something she could just conjure on demand. even if she'd wanted to pretend she didn't know how. She didn't know what to say, what motions to go through. She could have been easier on him. In truth, some part of her must have realized. In truth, some part of her must have relished his demotion. Not out of spite or vindictiveness, but because she wanted him to know. This is how I feel every day. Powerless, scared, she'd wanted him to feel it too. She'd wanted him to understand, to experience it for himself. Exhausted, her eyes heavy with sleep, she looked up as Leo entered the restaurant. She stood, approaching her husband, noticing his bloodshot eyes. She'd never seen him cry before. He turned away and poured himself a drink from the nearest bottle. She put a hand on his shoulder. It happened in a fraction of a second. Leo spun around, grabbing her by the neck and squeezing. "You did this." Her veins constricted, her face flushed red. She couldn't breathe. She was choking. Leo lifted her up. She was on the tips of her toes. Her hands fumbled at his grip, but he wouldn't let go, and she couldn't break his hold. She reached towards the tabletop, her fingers straining for a glass, her eyesight blurring. She managed to touch a glass, tipping it over. It fell within reach. She grabbed it, swinging and smashing it against the side of Leo's face. The glass cracked in her hand, cutting her palms. As if a spell had been broken, he released her. She fell back, coughing, holding her neck. They stared at each other, strangers, as though their entire history had been washed away in that fraction of a second. A shard of glass was embedded in Leo's cheek. He touched it and pulled the splinter out, surveying it in the palm of his hand. Without turning her back, she edged to the stairs, hurrying up, leaving him. Instead of following his wife, Leo downed the drink he'd already poured, and then poured another, and then another, and by the time he heard Nesterov's car outside, he'd finished most of the bottle. Unsteady on his feet, unwashed and unshaven, drunk, brutish and senselessly violent, it had taken him less than a day to sink to the level expected of the militia. During their car journey, Nesterov didn't mention the gash down Leo's face. He spoke in short bursts about the town. Leo wasn't listening. Barely conscious of his surroundings, preoccupied with the question of what he'd just done. Had he tried to strangle his wife, or was that some trick of his sleep-deprived brain? He touched the cut on his cheek, saw blood on his fingertip. It was true. He'd done it, and he'd been capable of more. Another couple of seconds, a slight tightening of his grip, and she would have died. His provocation was that he'd given up everything, his parents, his career, all on a false pretext, the promise of a family, the notion that there was some tie between them. She tricked him, fixed the odds, skewering his decision. Only once she was safe and his parents were suffering did she admit the pregnancy was a lie. Then she went further, openly describing how she'd helped him in contempt. She'd manipulated his sentimentality and then spat in his face in exchange for his sacrifice, in exchange for overlooking incriminating evidence of her guilt. He'd gotten nothing. But Leo didn't believe it for a second. The time of self-justification had ended. What he had done was unforgivable, and she was right to hold him in contempt. How many brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers had he arrested? How different was he from the man he considered his moral opposite, Vasily Nikitin. Was the difference merely that Vasily was senselessly cruel, while he'd been idealistically cruel? One was an empty, indifferent cruelty, while the other was a principled, pretentious cruelty which thought of itself as reasonable and necessary. But in real terms, in destructive terms, there was little to separate the two men. Had Leo lacked the imagination to realize what he was involved in? Or was it worse than that? Had he chosen not to imagine it, he'd shut down those thoughts, brushed them aside. Out of the rubble of his moral certainties, one fact remained. He'd laid down his life for Raisa, only to try and kill her. That was insanity. At this rate, he'd have nothing, not even the woman he'd married. He wanted to say, the woman he loved. Did he love her? He'd married her. Wasn't that the same? No, not really. He'd married her because she was beautiful, intelligent, and he was proud to have her by his side, proud to make her his. It was another step towards the perfect Soviet life. Work, family, children. In many ways, she was a cipher, a cog in the wheels of his ambitions, the necessary domestic background to his successful career. His status as a model citizen. Was Vasily right when he'd said that she could be substituted for another? On the train, he'd asked her to declare her love for him, to soothe him, to reward him with a romantic fantasy in which he was the hero. It was pathetic. Leo let out an audible sigh, rubbing his forehead. He was being outplayed, and that's exactly what this was to Vasily. A game, with the playing chips being denominations of misery. Instead of Vasily striking his wife, hurting her, Leo had done it for him, acting out every part of his plan. They'd arrived. The car had stopped. Nesterov was already out of the car and waiting for him. With no idea how long he'd be sitting there, Leo opened the car door, stepping out and following his superior officer into the militia headquarters to begin his first morning at work. Introduced to staff, shaking hands, nodding, agreeing but unable to take anything in, names, details, they washed over him. And it wasn't until he was alone in the locker room with a uniform hanging before him that he began to refocus on the present. He took off his shoes, slowly peeling back the socks from his bloody toes and running his feet under cold water, watching as the water turned red. Since he had no new socks and couldn't bring himself to ask for a new pair, he was forced to put the old socks back on, wincing in pain as he slid the material over his raw blisters. He stripped, leaving his civilian clothing in a heap at the bottom of a locker and buttoning up his new uniform. Coarse trousers with red piping and heavy military jacket. Coarse trousers with red piping and a heavy military jacket. He looked at himself in the mirror. There were black marks under his eyes. A weeping cut down his left cheek. He glanced at the insignia on his jacket. He was an Uchastkovy. He was nothing. The walls of Nestorov's office were decorated with framed certificates. Reading them, Leo discovered that his boss had won amateur wrestling competitions and rifle shooting tournaments and had received commendations as Officer of the Month on numerous occasions both here and at his former place of residence, Rostov. It was an ostentatious display, understandable considering that his position was held in such low esteem. Nesterov studied his new recruit, unable to work him out. Why was this man, a former high-ranking MGB officer with a decorated war record, in such a bedraggled state? His fingernails filthy, his face bleeding, his hair unwashed, stinking of alcohol and apparently indifferent to his demotion. Perhaps he was exactly as he'd been described. Grossly incompetent and unworthy of responsibility. His appearance certainly fitted the bill. But Nestorov wasn't convinced. Maybe this disheveled appearance was a trick. He'd been uneasy from the moment he'd heard about the transfer. This man had the potential to do untold damage to him and his men. One damning report, that was all it would take. Nestorov had decided the best course of action would be to observe this man, test him, and keep him close. Leo would eventually reveal his hand. Nestorov presented Leo with a file. Leo stared at it for a moment, trying to work out what was expected of him. Why was he being given this? Whatever it was, he didn't care. He sighed, forcing himself to study the file. Inside there were black and white photographs of a young girl. She was lying on her back, surrounded by black snow. Black snow. Black because it was soaked in blood. It seemed as though the girl was screaming. On closer inspection, there was something inside her mouth. Nestorov explained. Her mouth was stuffed with soil, so she couldn't scream for help. Leo's fingers tightened on the photo. All his thoughts about Raisa, his parents, about himself evaporated as his eyes focused on the girl's mouth. Leo's fingers tightened on the photo. All his thoughts about Raisa, his parents, about himself, evaporated as his eyes focused on the girl's mouth. It was wide open, stuffed with dirt. He glanced at the next photo. The girl was naked. Her skin, where it was undamaged, was as white as the snow. Her midriff had been savaged, torn open. He flicked to the next photo, and the next, and the next, not seeing a girl, but instead Fyodor's little boy. A boy who hadn't been stripped naked or had his stomach cut open. A boy whose mouth hadn't been stuffed with dirt. A boy who hadn't been murdered. Leo put the photos down on the table. He said nothing, staring at the certificates hanging on the wall. Same day. The two incidents had nothing to do with each other. The death of Fyodor's young boy and the murder of this young girl. It was impossible. They'd taken place hundreds of kilometers apart. This was a vicious irony, nothing more. But Leo had been wrong to dismiss Fyodor's allegations. Here was a child, murdered as Fyodor had described. Such a thing was possible. There was now no way of knowing what had really happened to Fyodor's son, Arkady, because Leo had never bothered to examine the boy's body for himself. Perhaps that death had been an accident, or perhaps the matter had been hushed up. If the latter was true, then Leo had been instrumental in orchestrating a cover-up. He'd done so unquestioningly, ridiculing, bullying, and finally threatening a grieving family. General Nestorov was frank about the details of this murder, calling it by no other name, murder, and giving no indication of wanting to portray it as anything other than a brutal and horrific crime. His frankness worried Leo. How could he be so cool? The yearly statistics for his department were supposed to conform to the predetermined patterns, decreasing crime rates, increasing social harmony. Although the town had undergone a vast increase in population, an influx of 80,000 uprooted workers, crime should have declined since the theory dictated that there was more work, more fairness, less exploitation. The victim's name was Larisa Petrova. She'd been found 4 days ago in the forest, not far from the train station. The details regarding the discovery of the body were vague, and when Leo had pressed the issue, Nestorov had seemed eager to brush the point aside. All Leo could gather was that the body had been discovered by a couple who drank too much and had retreated into the forest to fornicate. They'd stumbled across the little girl, who'd been lying in the snow for several months, her body perfectly preserved in the freezing cold. She was a school child, 14 years old. The militia knew her. She had a reputation for having a disorderly sex life, not just with boys of her own age, but with older men. She could be bought for a liter bottle of vodka. Larisa had argued with her mother on the day she went missing. Larisa's absence had been dismissed. She'd threatened to run away, and it seemed she'd followed through on her word. No one had looked for her. According to Nestorov, her parents were respected members of the community. Her father was an accountant at the assembly plant. They were ashamed of their daughter and wanted nothing to do with the investigation, which was to be kept secret, not covered up, but not publicized either. The parents agreed not to have a funeral for their child and were prepared to pretend that she was merely missing. There was no need for the community at large to know. Only a handful of people outside the militia were aware of the murder. Those people, including the couple who'd found the body, had been made clear of the consequences of talking. The matter would be concluded swiftly because they already had a man in custody. Leo was aware that the militia could only investigate after a criminal case had been opened, and that a criminal case was only opened if it was certain it would be concluded successfully. Failure to convict a suspect was unacceptable, and the consequences severe. Bringing a case to court was supposed to mean one thing: that the suspect was guilty. If a case was difficult, complex, ambiguous, it simply wouldn't be opened. For Nestorov and his subordinates to be this calm could only mean that they were convinced they had their man. Their job was done. The brainwork of investigations, the presentation of evidence, interrogations, and ultimately the prosecution itself were the duties of the state's investigative team, the procurator's office, and their team of sledovatelj, lawyers. Leo wasn't being asked to assist. He was being given a tour, expected to marvel at their efficiency. The cell was small, with none of the ingenious modifications typical of those in Lubyanka. There were concrete walls, a concrete floor. The suspect was seated, his hands cuffed behind his back. He was young, perhaps no more than 16 or 17, with an adult's muscular frame, but a child's face. His eyes seemed to roam with no particular sense of purpose. He didn't seem afraid. He was calm, although not in an intelligent way, and showed no signs of physical abuse. Of course, there were ways of inflicting injuries so the marks didn't show. But Leo's gut reaction was that the boy hadn't been harmed. Nestorov pointed at the suspect. "This is Varlam Babinich." At the sound of his name, the young man stared at Nestorov as a dog might stare at its owner. Nesterov continued. We found him in possession of a lock of Larissa's hair. He has a history of stalking Larissa, lingering outside her house, propositioning her in the street. Larissa's mother remembers seeing him on numerous occasions. She remembers her daughter complaining about him. He used to try and touch her hair. Nesterov turned to the suspect, speaking slowly. Varlam, tell us what happened. Tell us how you had a lock of her hair in your possession. I cut her. It was my fault. Tell this officer why you killed her. I liked her hair. I wanted it. I have a yellow book, a yellow shirt, a yellow tin, and some yellow hair. This is why I cut her. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. When can I have the blanket? Let's talk about that later, Leo interrupted. What blanket? 2 days ago he kidnapped a baby. It was wrapped in a yellow blanket. He has an obsession with the color yellow. Fortunately, the baby was unhurt. However, he has no sense of right or wrong. He does whatever he feels like without regard for consequence. Nesterov moved closer to the suspect. When I found Larissa's hair in your book, why did you think you'd be in trouble? Tell this man what you told me. She never liked me. She kept telling me to go away, but I wanted her hair. I wanted it so bad. And when I cut her hair, she didn't say anything at all. Nesterov turned to Leo, offering the questioning to him. Do you have any questions? What was expected of him? Leo thought for a moment before asking. Why did you stuff her mouth with soil? Varlam didn't answer immediately. He seemed confused. Yes, there was something in her mouth. I remember that now. Don't hit me, Nesterov answered. No one is going to hit you. Answer the question. I don't know. I forget things. There was dirt in her mouth, yes, Leo continued. Explain what happened when you killed her. I cut her. You cut her, or you cut her hair? I'm sorry, I cut her. Listen to me carefully. Did you cut her body, or did you cut her hair? I found her and I cut her. I should have said to somebody, but I was worried. I didn't want to get in trouble. Varlam began to cry. I'm in so much trouble. I'm sorry. I just wanted her hair. Nesterov stepped forward. That's enough for the moment. With these words of reassurance, Varlam stopped crying. He was calm again. It was impossible to tell from his face that this was a man in the frame for murder. Leo and Nesterov stepped outside. Nesterov shut the door to the cell. We have evidence that he was at the crime scene. Snow prints match his boots exactly. You understand that he's from the internet. He's a simpleton. Leo now understood Nesterov's bravery in addressing this murder head-on. They had a suspect who suffered from a mental disorder. Varlam was outside Soviet society, outside communism, politics. He was explainable. His actions didn't reflect on the party. They didn't alter the truism about crime because the suspect was not a real Soviet. He was an anomaly. He was an anomaly, Nesterov added. That shouldn't lull you into thinking he's incapable of violence. He's admitting killing her. He has a motive, an irrational one, but a motive. He wanted something he couldn't have, her blonde hair. He has a history of committing crimes when he can't get what he wants. Theft, kidnapping. Now he's turned to murder. To him, killing Larissa was no different from stealing a baby. His morality is undeveloped. It's sad. He should have been locked up a long time ago. This is a matter for the Sledovatyel now. This is a matter for the Sledovatyel now. Leo understood. The investigation was over. This young man was going to die. Same day. The bedroom was empty. Leo dropped to his knees, putting his head to the floorboards. Her case was missing. He stood up, ran out of the room, down the stairs and into the restaurant kitchen. Basarov was cutting fatty strips of an unidentifiable joint of yellow meat. "Where's my wife?" "Pay for the bottle and I'll tell you." He pointed to an empty bottle, the bottle of cheap vodka Leo had finished in the early hours of the morning, adding, "I don't care if it was you or your wife who drank it. Please, just tell me where she is. Pay for the bottle." Leo didn't have any money. He was still wearing his militia uniform. He'd left everything in the locker room. "I'll pay you later, however much you want." "Later? Sure. Later you'll pay me 1,000,000 rubles." Basarov continued cutting the meat, signaling his refusal to budge. Leo ran back upstairs, rifling through his case, throwing everything out. In the back of the book of propagandists, he had 25 ruble notes, 4 of them an emergency stash. He got to his feet, ran out, back down the stairs to the restaurant, pushing one of the notes into the man's hand, considerably more than a single bottle was worth. "Where is she?" "She left a couple of hours ago. She was carrying her case." "Where was she going?" "She didn't speak to me." "I didn't speak to her." "How long ago?" "Exactly how long ago?" 2 or 3 hours. 3 hours. That meant she was gone. Not just out of the restaurant, but quite possibly out of the town. Leo couldn't guess where she might be heading or which direction she'd be traveling. Feeling generous after his substantial reward, Basarov volunteered a little extra information. "It's unlikely she made it in time for the late afternoon train. As far as I remember, there isn't another train till right about now." "What time?" 7:30. Leo had 10 minutes. Ignoring his tiredness, he ran as fast as he could, but desperation choked him. Short of breath, he had only the roughest idea where the station was. He was running blindly, trying to recall the route the car had driven. His uniform was soaked with spray from the icy slush on the street, the cheap material getting heavier and heavier. His blisters rubbed and burst. His toes were bleeding again, his shoes filling with blood. Each step sent a searing pain through his legs. He turned a corner only to be confronted by a dead end, a line of wooden houses. He was lost. It was too late. His wife was gone. There was nothing he could do. Hunched over, trying to catch his breath, he remembered these ramshackle timber houses, the stench of human effluent. He was close to the station. He was sure of it. Rather than retrace his steps, he ran forward, entering the back of one of the huts, stepping into a family seated on the floor in the middle of a meal. Huddled around the stove, they stared up at him, silent, afraid at the sight of his uniform. Without saying a word, he stepped over the children and ran out, entering into the main street, the street they'd driven down on their arrival. The station was within sight. He tried to run faster, but he was slowing. Adrenaline could no longer compensate for exhaustion. He had nothing in reserve. He barged into the station doors, knocking them open with his shoulder. The clock showed it was 7:45. He was 15 minutes too late. The realization that she was gone, probably forever, began to crash across his mind. Leo clung to the groundless hope that somehow she'd be on the platform. Somehow she hadn't got on the train. He stepped out, looking right and left. He couldn't see his wife. He couldn't see the train. He felt weak. He leant forward, his hands on his knees, sweat running down the side of his face. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a man sitting on a bench. Why would a man still be on the platform? Was he waiting for a train? Leo straightened up. Raisa was at the far end of the platform, hidden in the gloom. It took an enormous effort not to run and grab her hands. Catching his breath, he was trying to think of what to say. He glanced at himself. He was a mess, sweating, filthy. But she wasn't even looking at him. She was looking over his shoulder. Leo turned around. Thick bursts of smoke were rising over the treetops. The delayed train was approaching. Leo had imagined taking time over his apology, finding the correct words, being eloquent. However, right now he had a matter of seconds to convince her. His words stumbled out. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking. I grabbed you, but that wasn't me. Or it wasn't the person I want to be. Hopeless. He had to do better. Slow down. Concentrate. He'd get one shot at this. Raisa, you want to leave me. You're right to want to leave me. I could tell you how difficult it would be on your own. How you might get stopped, questioned, arrested. How you don't have the right paperwork. You'd be a vagrant. But that's not a reason to stay with me. I know that you'd rather take your chances. Paperwork can be faked, Leo. I'd rather fake that than this marriage. There it was. The marriage was a sham. All Leo's words dried up. The train came to a halt alongside them. Raisa's face was impassive. Leo stepped out of her way. She moved towards the carriage. Could he let her go? Over the sound of grinding brakes, Leo raised his voice. The reason I didn't denounce you wasn't because I believed you were pregnant, and it had nothing to do with me being a good person. I did it because my family is the only part of my life that I'm not ashamed of. To Leo's surprise, Raisa turned around. Where does it come from? This overnight enlightenment. It feels cheap. Having been stripped of your uniform, your office, your power, you now have to make do with me. Is that it? Something which was never very important to you before. Us becomes important because you find yourself with nothing else. You don't love me. I know that. But there was a reason we got married. There was something between us, some connection. We've lost that. I've lost that. We can find it again. Carriage doors were opening. A handful of passengers were disembarking. Time was running out. Raisa looked at the carriage, weighing up her choices. They were pitiful. She had no friends to run to, no family who could shelter her, no money and no means of supporting herself. She didn't even have a ticket. Leo was right in his analysis. If she left, she'd probably get picked up by the authorities. She'd felt exhausted at the thought of it. She looked at her husband. They had nothing except each other, whether they liked each other or not. She put down her case. Leo smiled, obviously believing them to be reconciled. Annoyed with this idiotic interpretation, she raised her hand, cutting short his smile. I married you because I was scared. Scared that if I rejected your advances, I'd be arrested. Maybe not immediately, but at some point, on some pretext. I was young, Leo, and you were powerful. That is the reason we got married. That story you tell about me pretending that my name was Lena. You find that story funny, romantic. I gave you a false name because I was worried you'd track me down. What you took for seduction, I took for surveillance. Our relationship was built out of fear. Maybe not from your point of view. You have no reason to fear me. What power did I have? What power have I ever had? You asked me to marry you and I acquiesced because that's what people do. They put up with things they tolerate in order to survive. You never hit me or shouted at me. You were never drunk. So, on balance, I reckon that I was luckier than most. When you grabbed my neck, Leo, you removed the only reason I had for staying with you. The train pulled out. Leo watched it go, trying to digest what she'd said. But she gave him no pause, speaking as though these words had been forming in her head over many years. Now, tapped, they were flowing freely. The problem with becoming powerless, as you are now, is that people start telling you the truth. You're not used to it. You lived in a world protected by the fear you inspire. But if we're going to stay together, let's cut the deluded romanticism. Circumstance is the glue between us. I have you, you have me. We don't have very much else. And if we're going to stay together, from now on I tell you the truth. No comfortable lies. We're equal as we have never been equal before. You can take it or I can wait for the next train. Leo had no reply. He was unprepared, outgunned, outspoken. In the past, he'd used his position to get better accommodation, better food. He hadn't imagined he'd use it to get a wife too. Her voice softened a little. There are so many things to be afraid of. You can't be one of them. I never will again. I'm cold, Leo. I've been standing on this platform for 3 hours. I'm going back to our room. Are you coming? No. He didn't feel like walking back, side by side, a chasm between them. I'm going to stay here for a bit. I'll see you back there. Carrying her case, Raisa returned to the station building. Leo sat on the bench, staring into the forest. He shuffled through the memories of their relationship, re-examining each one, adjusting his understanding, rewriting his past. He'd been sitting there for he didn't know how long when he became aware of someone standing to the side of him. He looked up. It was the man from the ticket office, a youngish man, the man they'd met on their arrival. Sir, there are no more trains tonight. Do you have a cigarette? I don't smoke. I could get you one from our apartment. It's just upstairs. No, that's okay. Thank you, anyway. I'm Alexander. Leo. Do you mind if I stay here for a bit? Not at all. Let me get you that cigarette. Before Leo could answer, the young man had hurried off. Leo sat back and waited. he saw a wooden hut set back from the tracks. That was the place where the girl's body had been found. He could make out the edge of the forest, the crime scene, snow trampled down by detectives, photographers, investigative lawyers, all studying that dead girl, her mouth open, stuffed with soil. Struck by a thought, Leo stood up, hurried forward, lowering himself off the platform, crossing the tracks and heading towards the trees. Behind him, a voice called out, "What are you doing?" He turned around and saw Alexander standing on the edge of the platform, holding a cigarette. He gestured for him to follow. Leo reached the area where the snow had been trodden down. There were crisscrossing boot tracks in all directions. He entered the forest, walking for a couple of minutes, arriving at roughly the area where he supposed the body must have laid. He crouched down. Alexander caught up with him. Leo looked up. "You know what happened here?" "I was the one who saw Ilyana. I was the one who saw Ilinaya running to the station. She was badly beaten up, shaking. She couldn't speak for a while. I called the militia." "Ilinaya?" "She found the body, stumbled across it. Her and the man she was with." The couple in the forest. Leo had known there was something wrong. "Why was she beaten up?" Alexander looked nervous. "She's a prostitute. The man she was with that night is an important party official. Please, don't ask me anymore." Leo understood. This official wanted his name kept out of all the paperwork. But could he be a suspect in the murder of a young girl? But could he be a suspect in the murder of the young girl? Leo nodded at the young man, trying to reassure him. "I won't mention you, I promise." Leo's hands pushed through the thin sheet of snow. The girl's mouth was filled with soil, loose soil. "Imagine I was struggling with you, right here, and I reached out to grab something to stuff into your mouth because I'm afraid you're going to scream. I'm afraid someone's going to hear you." Leo's fingers hit the ground. It was hard, like the surface of a stone. He tried another place, then another, and another. There was no loose soil. The ground was frozen solid.